Thank you. It's a pleasure to be back here to see, in quotation marks, some very familiar faces. It was just about a year ago that I spoke, as I typically do, at Potomac in March. And of course, we were all just getting used to COVID at that point. And I've done a lot of speaking in the months since then, almost entirely on Zoom. And I want to tell you, I had my first experience speaking on Zoom at Potomac. We sort of stumbled through that session, 3 weeks, and I learned a lot, and it helped me for later experiences. I want to condense the topic that I'm going to be discussing this morning, at least the general topic, which is suggested by the title of this set of talks. Race relations in the history of American Presbyterianism is a much broader topic than just black-white relations. That's the first point I want to make. It's a much broader topic than just black-white relations. It has to do with Native Americans, Asian Americans, and so forth. I'm only going to focus on the black-white aspect because it's central to, I think, the issues that confront us as a nation today and as a church. And it's a long, complicated story. Just simply to begin to do justice to that in 3 talks is a tall order. So I'm going to focus just on black-white relations. I'm going to focus, secondly, on the larger, sometimes characterized as mainline Presbyterian denominations, and I'm not going to say much about the smaller ones. There are a whole series of smaller ones, and occasionally I'll make reference to them, but mainly I'll be focusing on the more prominent ones, the larger ones in our nation. Thirdly, I want to stress, and this seems to me a very important thing to just note at the beginning. I'm going to talk about this problem from the side of both the blacks and the whites, from the side of both the blacks and the whites. And I'm going to talk about the views of Black Presbyterians from the earliest time, the 18th century. I stress that because you can read histories of American Presbyterianism in which there are references to race relations and almost no references to who the blacks were and what their views were. That's maybe not surprising, but it is definitely a problem, and it needs to be corrected. And in my remarks, I'm going to be trying to make you aware of something that I think most of us are unaware of, and that is the history of this problem from the side of Black Presbyterians. There will be 3 phases in this series of talks. I'm going to talk today about slavery, the era of slavery. Secondly, next week I will talk about the era of segregation, which is in its own way every bit as important as slavery. And then finally, in the third talk, I will talk about desegregation, the mid-20th century and later. In the remarks I'm going to make about this first chapter, this first phase today, I'm going to divide it into 3 parts. I'm going to talk initially about who the Presbyterians were, building on things I actually talked about last time when I was here at Potomac. I'm going to talk a little bit about the nature of the Presbyterian settlement of North America. Secondly, I will talk about the institution of slavery, what it was in the period we're talking about. And then finally, and most important, Presbyterian attitudes, both black and white. If you were here when I was presenting last time, you may remember that I said the following: Presbyterianism in America, in the United States, or what became the United States, it wasn't then, of course, in the British colonies, begins formally in 1706. That's the first date, 1706. And the reason I say that is because that was the date of the formation of the first presbytery. The first presbytery in the British colonies was the work of a man called Francis Makemie, a Scot-Irish who had come to these shores and actually was a very good businessman and got rich as a result, as well as a clergyman. His day job was making money, and his night job was pastoring. And he was a very committed Presbyterian and was convinced that the only way you could have Presbyterian churches was to have a presbytery and ultimately a synod. The first synod was created in 1716. So 1706, 1716. That tells us something, however, very important, and that is that in order to have this presbytery created, which was the work of 7 or 8 people, you had to have Presbyterian congregations. And so it's pretty clear that there were Presbyterian congregations created in the 17th, not the 18th, but the 17th century, that is the 1600s. Now, almost all of the Presbyterian activity in the first years, the first decades of this emerging Presbyterian world in North America was in the middle colonies. Let me stress that again, the middle colonies. It was not in New England, it was not in the South, it was in the middle colonies. Areas like Delaware, New Jersey, yes, to some extent Maryland, southern New York. That's where these people were located. That's where they created their churches. And that was the place, of course, where the first presbytery was created, called, interestingly enough, the Presbytery of Philadelphia. They came and settled initially in the middle colonies and then spread out in 2 directions. They spread west, especially the Scots-Irish, about which I will say more in just a moment. The Scots-Irish came and began moving west all the way as far as Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh was the far west at this point, and then into Kentucky, and then down into you might characterize it as the northern tier of what we now think of as the South. They were particularly concentrated in Virginia, North Carolina, and to some extent South Carolina. The penetration of Presbyterians farther south comes later. They came primarily from 3 ethnic groups. They were Scots, of course, and some of the most prominent Presbyterians were Scots, but of course also English, particularly renegade English Puritans from New England, who for various reasons were uncomfortable with the ethos of Puritanism in New England and migrated farther south. And then finally, and by far the largest group, were the Scots-Irish, who came from Ulster, the famous Ulster plantation, and came in the middle decades of the 18th century in droves. They had a kind of population explosion of Presbyterians as these Scots-Irish came in large numbers into the middle colonies and then west and then somewhat south. They, above all, were the sort of ethnic base of American Presbyterianism in this period. Another important thing to know about them, which I think is directly relevant to our topic, is that they were middle-class people. Indeed, for the most part, there were exceptions, but for the most part, when they came to this side of the Atlantic, they were lower middle class. They were people who had very modest means. In some cases, they were coming to the British colonies out of economic distress. They had not done terribly well on the other side of the Atlantic. And they came here in the hope, as so many people came here, in the hope of starting a new life, having a better life. And in many cases, for a couple of reasons I'm going to indicate, they succeeded. They were very successful in the business world, especially as farmers. Small farmers eventually became large farmers. And also, they were enterprising people, but in addition to that, it will not surprise you at all to hear that they were almost fanatically devoted to education. They were almost fanatically devoted to education, especially for their children. They wanted their children to be educated well. And the result of that, of course, was very often upward mobility, upward social mobility. So over time, more wealth, rising, you might say, in the world of occupation. So many of them, the children especially, became highly educated people who became educators and lawyers and physicians and so forth in the professions. They, especially once they got some numbers, were large enough to become influential. And in the course of the struggle for independence of what eventually became the United States of America, they became very influential. And part of the reason that they became very influential in the nation in the making, nation on the way to becoming independent, was that they almost, without exception, were on the side of independence. Let me say that again. They were almost entirely on the side of independence, and in particular, the clergy were on the side of independence. Indeed, the British came to think of the Presbyterians as being so uniformly on the side of independence that they sort of characterized the Presbyterians as a group as the enemy of their interests in the colonies. I've already implied this, but let me underscore it now. They enjoyed rapid growth in the middle decades of the 18th century, with the result that they were a very significant force in terms of numbers, probably in the range of somewhere between 15 and 20% of the total population of the colonies by the time of the struggle for independence. Now, the vast majority of these people, being immigrants, were white. But, and here was one of my more important points, from a very early time in the 18th century, there were Black Presbyterians. Let me say that again. From a very early time, in the early part of the development of American Presbyterianism, probably somewhere in the range of 1720s and 1730s, certainly by the 1740s, there were Black Presbyterians. And who were these Black Presbyterians? They were free Blacks, and there were free Blacks all along. In the era of slavery, there were free Blacks, and especially in the middle colonies, there were free Blacks. And these free Blacks eventually, toward the end of the century, begin to form Black Presbyterian congregations. Let me say that again. Toward the end of the 18th century, or just after the founding of the nation, you get the beginnings of the founding of Black Presbyterian congregations, pastored by Black clergy, authorized by presbyteries. And of course, authorization by presbyteries means that these pastors were sufficiently well educated that the presbytery could recognize them as appropriate for pastoring congregations. Some of these people in the early years had slaves, but many did not. Let me say that again. Some of these people had slaves. Keep in mind their lower middle class status at the beginning. The lower middle class folks generally didn't have slaves. It was people of some means who had slaves. But over time, the number of Presbyterians who had slaves grew. And I'll talk about that in a moment. The numbers and the way in which that developed, and especially did that, it will not surprise you at all to hear, that especially did the number who had slaves, and in turn the number of slaves, grow as Presbyterianism became stronger and stronger in the South, that is, in what became the Confederate States. Now, what about slavery? What about the institution of slavery? I don't want to insult anybody's intelligence in this group. I know at Potomac Presbyterian Church, where people actually read books and sort of follow events. By the way, I don't take that for granted. Actually, and continue to read books, not just read books back in the day, but continue to read books. So this is a congregation of people who know a lot. But just so we're all on the same sort of level playing field, let me say a few things about the institution of slavery. One of the most important things I have to say about it at the beginning is the following. It existed as an institution, a well-established institution, when Presbyterianism was created in the British colonies. Let me say that again. It existed. It was a well-established institution. Indeed, it was a taken for granted institution when the American Presbyterianism finally begins to emerge. And I say that with reference to, in particular, something you may already know about well. The New York Times 1619 Project, which you may or may not be familiar with, but it's certainly been in the news over the last couple of years. One of the things that 1619 Project has done, which I think is just unambiguously a good thing, is that it has reminded us of the fact that slavery was a part of the very founding experience of the British colonies in North America. And that date 1619 is important. That's the first date that we have a recorded, clearly a recorded fact of the importation of slaves from Africa to colonies on this side of the Atlantic. So from let's say the 1620s on, you had slavery in in the American colony. Now think about the dates of that, 1620s all the way up to the founding of the American Republic in the 1780s. Think about that's a century and a half right there, better than a century and a half. Now I stress this for the following reason. I think one of the biggest challenges that Christians face then and now is to, in their own minds, challenge directly, and in their behavior, challenge directly some well-established institution. Just think about the established institutions in our society. There are many of them. And the tendency, I think, on the part of people who inherit some established institutions is to take for granted their legitimacy. Not everybody, I don't want to suggest everybody, but that's a very common human response. If you've grown up with something, if it's there, if it's established, if your neighbors take it for granted, if it's woven into the fabric of society, well, the tendency, I think, on the part of so many people, maybe I'm just speculating too much here, but I think it's probably true to say most people are inclined to say, well, that's just the way things are. That's just the way things are. And in turn, if you're a Christian, to develop all kinds of rationalizations for the existence of this institution. Even if you thought about it for very long, you might say, this is problematic. Slavery was a part of the fabric of life as American Presbyterianism began to develop. It came with the colonization of North America by the British and others. Let me say that again. It came with, it was part of the project, it was part of the deal, if you will, of colonization of North America by the British and others. I'm sure all of you know that the colonization of North America by the British and others, the Dutch and so forth, was very much, it was not just a search for independence, it was a colonial project designed to yield commercial results. And a big part of that was the importation of slaves for certain economic practices. Now, I want to stress slavery in the period we're talking about, in the place we're talking about. Keep in mind, there's been slavery for centuries. But the slavery that we're talking about in this particular place and in this particular time took more than one form. Let me say that again. It took more than one form. Why? Because many times Native Americans were enslaved by the whites. That's a different kind of slavery, somewhat different kind of slavery. It was much more uniformly the fate of Native Americans to be enslaved. In the case of the blacks, however, it was a very, very common assumption that that was the normal thing, the customary thing, with the exception of some free blacks. And it was chattel slavery. And let me stress what that means. It was chattel slavery. If you've been exposed in your reading, in your education at all, to the institution of slavery in the ancient world, in ancient Rome and Greece, for example, you will encounter there slaves that were treated almost as equals by their owners, highly educated people. This is some of what I think is the background in the biblical times. Slavery was not always an institution which imposed upon the victims of slavery the status of being mere things. Let me say that again, mere things, like a beast of burden. If you're farming, for example, you have beasts of burden. And they're treated relatively, it's not the exaggeration to say, like things, like property in the inanimate sense. Well, chattel slavery at the time of the development of the colonies on this side of the Atlantic was very much chattel slavery. The African Americans were treated like property, and property sometimes in a very base way. And it was justified in those terms. The people who were justifying slavery had to justify that, you might say, very grim form of slavery. And they knew that, and they tried to come to terms with it in that way. The institution of slavery started small and grew. That's the next important thing to note. It started small and grew. And especially did it grow, and this is deeply ironic and maybe troubling, the institution of slavery in terms of the number of people who were enslaved The number of people who were enslaved grew dramatically after the achievement of American independence. Let me say that again. It expanded, it grew dramatically after the achievement of American independence, especially in the first part of the 19th century, after the founding of the American Republic. And why was that? Well, because it was a way for people to get rich. It was economically advantageous. It was economically advantageous once the development of American life and American society, and more specifically the American economy, was linked very closely, as it was in the South, to plantation forms of agriculture. Let me stress that, plantation forms of agriculture. It became evident and kind of obvious to people who were monitoring these things that certain crops could be very, very beneficial in the commerce that went on between the American colonies and the other side of the Atlantic, especially Britain. And those crops were, you know them well, rice, tobacco, sugar, crops, all of which relied upon for any kind of expansive production on a large labor force. And what better labor force, cheap labor, if you will, was to rely heavily upon slaves. And so as you might say, the plantation form of agriculture flourished in the first part of the 19th century, so did the institution of slavery in terms of the number of people who were subjected to it. Now, that's just some very, very, very cursory examination of some very basic facts. And now with that as background, I want to talk about our main focus for this morning, and indeed for all of the presentations I'm going to be giving, Presbyterian attitudes. Presbyterians are developing their church in this environment. This is the world they inhabit. And how did they respond to the institution of slavery? Let me first make this observation. This talk could be short if I were focusing simply on Blacks. Black Presbyterians had pretty much the same view, insofar as we can tell, and there were some very noteworthy Black leaders, Black Presbyterian leaders, who had pretty much the same view across the board, and that view was the following. This institution is wrong. Full stop. This is wrong. This is completely wrong. It's contrary to the will of God, and it should be eliminated forthwith. One of the most prominent Black leaders, not just in the church, but in the whole Black community, was a man called Henry Hyland Garnett. Henry Hyland Garnett. I commend to you some study, you can do it easily on the web, of this Henry Hyland Garnett, who was actually in the Black world the equal of Frederick Douglass, and to some extent a critic of Frederick Douglass. Henry Hyland Garnett was an outspoken abolitionist. He was a pastor for a while of the 15th Street Presbyterian Church, historic Presbyterian Church in Washington, D.C. Henry Hyland Garnett was actually more radical than Frederick Douglass, insisting that this institution, slavery, was utterly, he characterized it as despicable in the eyes of God, and therefore it had to be eliminated. And any man, he said, of good conscience, Christian or not, will grasp that point and take whatever steps are necessary to eliminate this institution. In short, Henry Hyland Garnett, arguably the most prominent Black Presbyterian of the time, said flatly, you've got to be an abolitionist. You've got to be an abolitionist if you're going to be a good Christian. Now, I stress that for the following reason. You will hear people say, well, back in the day, they didn't know any better. It was the common assumption of everybody that that slavery was just God's will. Well, I'm going to be kind here and just say, if you know the facts, that just could not be the case. If you were at all aware as a Presbyterian of what other Presbyterians were saying, especially Black Presbyterians, you would have to at least recognize this is a problematic institution, slavery. Highly problematic institution. Now, having said that, let me add the following, and this will be a theme I develop as we go along. The tendency of white Presbyterians, even with some exceptions, even with articulate leaders like Henry Hyland Garnett, was to ignore their views. For the longest time, white Presbyterians ignored, on the whole, the views of Black Presbyterians, even when those black figures were highly articulate and spoke in settings where white Presbyterians could not help but be exposed to. So if I were focusing simply in this talk on the views of Black Presbyterians, I could say, all right, we're done here. Now let's have a discussion. Fortunately or unfortunately for you, it's necessary for me to say something more, because when it comes to the white views on this subject are extraordinarily complex. We've got a complex mix of different views among white Presbyterians in this time. And keep in mind, I'm talking about a period which runs roughly from the 1750s up through the time of the Civil War. Let me say that again. What I'm about to talk about is a period roughly from the 1750s up through the time of the Civil War, because that's when the 1750s through the 1850s, 1860s is when Presbyterians themselves were caught up in a debate about this. Presbyterians themselves were caught up in a debate about this. That's the other rejoinder I would make to people who say, well, they didn't know any better. If you were at all active in the Presbyterian Church, especially as clergy, but also as lay people, as elders going to Presbyterian meetings and synod meetings and so forth, you could hardly avoid confrontation with this subject. And it went on and on and on. Occasionally, I will encounter a Presbyterian, not at Potomac, but somewhere else, who will say, if we just get politics, keep politics and religion separate, that would be fine. Well, in the history of American Presbyterianism, that has been very difficult to achieve, because Presbyterians kind of naturally have been drawn to the idea that their religion has some implications for public life. And naturally, that leads to debates and conflicts on many different issues. Let me begin with a summary statement here about the involvement of Presbyterians in the institution of slavery by the time of the most intense debates. And the most intense debates were in the mid-decades of the 19th century, the 1840s, 50s, and of course 60s, leading to the time of the Civil War. I had the impression, and it's hard to document this, but I have the impression that the vast majority of Presbyterians were not intensely involved in this debate, although I think a good number could be characterized as having to, in their own congregations at least, have some awareness of it, and to some extent even involvement in the debate. The people who really were outspoken on this were on the extremes. It will not surprise you. The people who were really outspoken on this topic were on the extremes. On the one hand, there were at one end the abolitionists. I've already mentioned one, Henry Hyland Garnett, who was a Black leader. There were other Black leaders I could mention. There were also white leaders who were strong abolitionists. Let me give you a name a name of a figure that I deeply respect, Benjamin Rush. Benjamin Rush was a political leader in the United States, signer of the Declaration, a physician, a kind of Renaissance man who was both a public figure and a physician. He was an outspoken abolitionist. As a matter of fact, was one of the founders of the American Abolition Society. And he was very active in the councils and debates of the Presbyterian Church, and there were others. So you have people who were strong proponents of the abolition of slavery, and dare I say, right now. Don't tell me you can't do it in the short run. No. We've got to take steps right now. At the other end of the spectrum were people who had exactly the opposite view. And I guess it will not surprise you to hear the following. As slavery became a really important institution in economic terms, I would say above all in the second quarter of the 19th century, the second quarter of the century of the 1800s, leading up to the Civil War, it was becoming more and more important because those crops were so important. Cotton and rice and tobacco and sugar. Sugar was another one. And by the way, let me just throw out parenthetically, if you really were an abolitionist, and there were kind of voluntary societies devoted to this. Many people abstained from the use of sugar because they thought it would be a kind of blow against the institution of slavery. By the way, in the British Isles, that was a very popular thing among abolitionists. They campaigned for a kind of boycott of sugar. So there was a lot of activism of that kind going on. But at the other end of the spectrum were these people who said the following: we think it's appropriate, based upon our reading of the Bible. That's another important thing. Based upon our reading of the Bible, we think it's important to conclude that slavery for some people is God's will. Slavery is God's will. And they had elaborate biblical exegesis to go with that. And by the way, if you read the Bible in what sometimes is characterized as a common sense literalist way, without any kind of sort of spirit of the text stuff, if you just look at particular passages, you can pluck out passages and say, well, look, Paul accepts the institution of slavery, so why can't we? And it's undoubtedly the case that there are passages in the Bible that seem to assume the existence of slavery. Yeah. Seem to assume the existence of slavery, and you could imagine somebody who wants to defend slavery jumping from that to say, this is God's will. At any rate, and by the way, as time went by, especially in the South, there were theologians, pastors and others, theologians who were writing things. And I've sent you a reading list, I think, with a reference there to a theology of segregation that you can actually call up online, where a pastor is articulating this theology, which became very popular, especially in the Deep South. So you have two extremes: abolition right now, and it's God's will, and presumably it's God's will forever. And implied in that was that there are certain races, certain categories of people whose destiny in the mind of God is to be enslaved. There was even an argument made by those folks which said slavery is for the good of the enslaved. The enslaved are better off being enslaved. And then, of course, there were all kinds of mediating positions from across the spectrum. Let me give you just a couple of those mediating or middle ground views. Abolitionists, in the strict sense, I've already indicated, said the institution of slavery had to be eliminated right now. A lot of people, for various reasons that I'll get into in just a moment, were very uneasy with that claim. And so they adopted versions of a position which had the following premise: even if slavery is a bad thing, we can't eliminate it quickly. By the way, that is such a common view in response to almost anything we've confronted in society that we think is problematic. We can't just do away with it. So maybe over time, decades from now, we'll be in a position to gradually do away with this institution. So that became the moderate view among abolitionists. Abolitionists oftentimes saying we can take moderate steps, but no more than moderate steps in order to eventually make this institution less and less popular. At the other end of the spectrum, shall we say, a more moderate view with regard to the defense of slavery was this: we need to humanize this institution. Even if we admit that slavery is God's will, it's certainly not God's will for us to torment and abuse our fellow humans. That cannot be God's will. So if slavery is a defensible institution, it's defensible presumably only if the slave owner treats slaves in a way that is humane. And so there were actually societies developed to promote the humanization of the institution of slavery. So you had this spectrum, but before I get to the details of the debate, let me now move to a, you might say, curious, but I think important fact, and that is, even though there were all these different opinions, different views, profoundly different in some cases, there was general agreement among Presbyterians, as far as I can make out, about four things, which are absolutely fundamental for our thinking about this subject. And here are the four things. Number one, There was agreement among Presbyterians, and I'm talking here about mainly white Presbyterians. There was agreement among white Presbyterians that Negro slaves were human beings, full stop. Now, I'm pausing here because it should take your breath away that that was a question. But boy, is it what it was. It was at the center of many of the debates in the United States of America about the institution of slavery. Are these people really people? Are they human beings? And many of the defenders of slavery denied that. Or if they accepted it, they accepted it in some very qualified form. Yeah, they're sort of human, half human, maybe somewhere between the status of an animal and a human being. Presbyterians, as far as I can see, never really got into that kind of debate. There was an assumption these are human beings. And that's related to a couple of other critically important assumptions. These, because they're human beings, these Negroes, because they're human beings, are also people with souls, people with immortal souls, people whose destiny, therefore, in eternity has to be important to us as Christians. They are human beings, and ultimately they will meet their master just like we are going to meet our master. And for that reason, related point, they are not only fit subjects, there is some urgency about this, they need to be evangelized. They need to be converted. They need to be brought into the fellowship of Christians. Now, I don't know whether you've seen this PBS series that's developing now on the Black church. But if you've seen that, and I commend it to you, one of the most interesting things is in the first part where they talk about great resistance on the part of slave owners to evangelization. Great resistance on the part of slave owners to evangelization because you're about to see the rest of this unfold. They were not stupid, they saw that with evangelization would come some politically problematic implications. So point number one, they really are human beings. Point number two, as fully human beings, they're entirely appropriate objects of evangelization on the part of the church. Indeed, we have a duty, Presbyterians typically said, we have a duty to evangelize the slaves, and slave owners have a responsibility to evangelize their own slaves. And again, if you're a slave owner, I'm sure you're thinking about that in a very complicated way. That's not a simple thing to conclude at all. And then, as if to complicate things further, here comes the third shared premise by Presbyterians in thinking about this topic. Because they're human beings with the same destiny, ultimate destiny as the rest of us, and therefore should be evangelized, another very important part of their thinking was the following. These are creatures who have the capacity, mental capacities, to read and write and to engage in other, shall we say, higher, more distinctively human activities. It's not appropriate to think of them simply as beasts of burden. Now, I hope all of you know, I've talked about the Protestant Reformation so many times at Potomac, you probably can give this part of the speech right here, but especially for Protestants and especially for Presbyterians, there is this kind of assumption, if you are going to evangelize, you are going to promote literacy. Because why? Well, because that's part of the package. Give people access to the Bible. Well, you got to, in order to give them access to the Bible so they can read it for themselves, they've got to be able to read and write. That's why all over the world, Reformed Christians have this kind of, as I said earlier, it's kind of obsession. Create schools, create colleges, create universities. Why? Because literacy is the foundation of good evangelism. Well, now, I'm guessing most of you know, but let's just underscore this. Throughout much of the South, during the period of the Confederacy, it was illegal to teach slaves to read and write. It was illegal. And again, I hope you understand why. This is just a straightforward, obvious political problem. Allow slaves to read and write, and then you're on your way to, well, who knows? Dangerous thing. Presbyterians, on the whole, they were kind of committed to this as a premise of their whole outlook, and it was applied specifically to the institution of slavery. And then finally, the fourth one, and this may surprise you. In the era of slavery, the premise was not that it was desirable for Negroes and whites to worship separately, quite the contrary. In the era of slavery, the idea was that Negroes, slaves, should be, as much as possible, woven into the worship life of the white churches. Let me say that again, woven into the worship life of white churches. They should worship together. And of course, you would then have that practice, which I'm sure many of you have heard about, of the slaves being brought to church by the white slave owners and typically located in some place other than the pews where the whites sat. I'm the member, by the way, a member of a church, Lewinsville, where Emily was our associate pastor at one point. That church goes back to the 1840s, and I'm told that when the church was founded in the 1840s, it had slave owners in it, and there was a balcony where the slaves sat as part of the worship experience, and it was assumed that the white slave owners had a responsibility not only to provide religious opportunity for religious learning for the slaves, but that the slaves should worship together with the whites on a regular basis. You will see next week how things changed dramatically in the era of segregation. But in the era of slavery, the assumption was they will worship together. You might say to me immediately, well, then how do we get Black Presbyterian churches, to which I've alluded? And that's a fascinating thing. And it has to do mainly with the experience of Blacks in the North, outside the South, free Blacks in the period leading up to the Civil War. Now, with these four premises, you might say, how could they possibly disagree? Well, I haven't got time to do justice to it, but let me just say each of the parties, whether on the abolitionist side or the defense of slavery side, could take these four premises and turn them in their own way to yield the conclusion they were looking for. Now, to make a long story short, especially from the time of the First General Assembly, which took place in 1789, First Presbyterian General Assembly, which was the founding of the Presbyterian Church in the United States of America as an independent church, not an extension of some European church. You might say the Declaration of Ecclesiastical Independence by the Presbyterians in 1789. From that point on, from 1789 all the way up to the time of the Civil War, there was a tough, difficult struggle that went on in the church over the issue of slavery. It went on and on and on. It went on at the General Assembly level, at the Synod level, at the Presbytery level, and even at the congregational level. I've already referred to my own church. Let me say again, what I've been able to glean about the life of that church is that when the Civil War came, the church split right down the middle over the issue of slavery. Right down the middle. You can imagine what session meetings must have been like when these matters were discussed. Some people left the church, by the way, over these struggles. The most important thing that happened in this period that I want to call your attention to was a pronouncement of the General Assembly of the denomination in 1817. 1817, well before, of course, the Civil War. But it's symptomatic of what was happening. It's very clear that in the late 1700s and early 1800s, as the church was developing as a national independent church, it's pretty clear from the record that the opponents of slavery got the upper hand in these debates. And the best evidence of that is all the pronouncements which came out, and especially this one in 1817, which the General Assembly adopted by a large margin. This is the General Assembly, the Presbyterian Church, after all these debates. And here's the gist of it. I won't bore you with all the details, but the gist of it was this. Slavery as an institution is sinful and contrary to the will of God. Full stop. No qualification. Contrary to the will of God. And participation in the institution of slavery is itself a grievously sinful act. Grievously sinful act. For which the only proper response is repentance. And just imagine yourself as a slave owner reading this. The only appropriate response is repentance. And then to complete the argument, if you will, and when members of our church, whether clergy or lay people, continue to participate in the institution of slavery in any way, give it their support, participate in this institution, they should be subject to ecclesiastical discipline. And by the way, Calvin's definition of the church defined ecclesiastical discipline as one of the three marks of a true church. Ecclesiastical, and what did ecclesiastical discipline in this case mean? Well, if somebody had been ordained to ministry of word and sacrament and owned slaves and refused to repent and change his ways, that person should be stripped of his ordination. This is pretty tough discipline. If a lay person who is an elder in the church, an owner of slaves, persists in his participation in the institution of slavery and refuse to repent of it, that person should be, once again, stripped of his ordination. And more broadly, people in the life of our church who continue to participate in the institution of slavery should be, and they after proper encouragement to repent, refuse to change their ways, they should be denied access to the Lord's table. Now, you can't get more severe in terms of ecclesiastical discipline than that within the Presbyterian world. 1817, that's the General Assembly. And this is at a time, by the way, when General Assembly pronouncements really had a kind of force in the life of the church in a way that, needless to say, subsequently they have come not to have. Now, all of that was said, but then you might say the bottom line, the sort of caveat, the codicil at the end was the following. How will this be implemented? Well, we'll leave that up to the presbyteries. How will this be implemented? We'll leave that up to the presbyteries. Well, of course, the presbyteries tend to be creatures of what? Local culture. Mm-hmm. And so routinely throughout all of the South, this was not only ignored, but joked about. And people who tried to get it enforced were themselves disciplined. People who tried to, for example, clergy, speaking about other clergy who were strong abolitionists themselves, refused and wanted to put pressure on their slaveholding colleagues, oftentimes were disciplined for their troublemaking in the life of the church. And so, and by the way, the end of all this was when there was pushback on it. What about this local control takes the teeth out of the pronouncement? The standard argument was, for the peace and unity of the church, we must make this compromise. It's kind of eerie echo down through the decades. For the peace and unity of the church, we must make this compromise. Now let me draw a contrast here. I'm just about done, but let me draw a contrast here with the Quakers, which is an interesting, I think, study in sort of religion and social change, because both the Presbyterians and the Quakers were caught up in this debate. And by the way, there were many Quakers who owned slaves. And the Quakers had a very decentralized church government too. They didn't have a very authoritarian or centralized ecclesiastical structure at all. But a mood came over the Quakers, especially in Pennsylvania, but not just Pennsylvania. And of course, Pennsylvania was, you might say, the heartland of the Quaker, the Friends societies at that time. A kind of mood came over in this same period, the 1750s through the 1850s. A mood came over the Quaker meetings, which tended in the direction of abolitionism. More and more Quakers were of the view, well, one Quaker put it very well, slavery is a despicable institution. A despicable institution. And you begin hearing that kind of talk in these meetings, of course, where friends gather to what? Discuss the faith, among other things, among themselves. And several historians have pointed out that the Quakers ended up with a very different outcome to what the Presbyterians, and by the way, the Presbyterians were not very different here from what we have come to characterize as mainline Protestant denominations. The mainline Protestant denominations made these compromises, all of these compromises that I just characterized as the great Presbyterian compromise. The Quakers didn't, because this ethos came over the Friends meetings in which people who were defenders of slavery felt themselves very uncomfortable. They just felt themselves in this atmosphere in which the sort of the mood of the body was steadily moving in the direction of, dare I say, a kind of consensus that was close to abolitionism. And as a result, Quakers ended up with, de facto, a kind of principled opposition to slavery that the Presbyterians never achieved. Let me say that again. The Quakers achieved a principled opposition to the institution of slavery that the Presbyterians never achieved.
Right.
Now, the last thing I want to say about this is the following. Even though the Presbyterians worked mightily, all right, let me rephrase that. Except for the extremes, the Presbyterians worked mightily to hold things together. Peace and unity of the church, peace and unity of the church. Yeah, but there are these extremes, peace and unity of the church, peace and unity of the church. They worked mightily to keep the peace and unity of the church, and they failed. Why? Because starting around the 1830s, there was one split after another. Split after split after split after split. And even when the ostensible issue was not slavery, the implicit issue was slavery. Because they couldn't get together very long, they found, on practically, I don't care whether new school, old school, all kinds of different versions of Presbyterianism, they couldn't get together without at some point bringing up slavery, and it drove them to division. And of course, ultimately, it led to the big division, which I'll talk about next week, that occurs in 1861 with the formation of the Confederate States. The response on the part of Presbyterians living in those areas, the Confederate States, is promptly to distance themselves from the main denomination and create a new denomination called the Presbyterian Church in the Confederate States, later to be known as the Presbyterian Church in the United States or the Southern States, PCUS. The original form was the Presbyterian Church in the Confederate States, later to be the Presbyterian Church in the United States, formed in 1861, and it existed all the way to the 1980s. Let me stress that. All the way. That division, which was established in 1861, carried most of the white Southern churches out of the denomination, persisted for over a century, well into the latter part of the 20th century. And with that came a whole new, different Southern Presbyterian culture, and I have to say, which on the whole was premised on the idea of the legitimacy of segregation. Now, that is leading me into next week's topic, so I'm going to stop right there and invite, we've got a few minutes, I want to invite whatever questions you may have and comments you may have.
I have a comment and a question. Can you hear me?
I can.
Thank you. Comment-wise, I just wanted to question your characterization of slavery in the ancient world. I certainly think it was true of the way the Romans viewed the Greeks. In fact, it was a marker of being wealthy to have a Greek tutor for your children. But I think chattel type slavery also existed at that time. And also in the African tribes, right up until about 100 and so years ago, there were slaves captured often in the confrontation between Christian and Muslim tribes that certainly came very close to chattel slavery as well. But my real question was, I was interested to know what was happening in the Catholic Church as we were going through all of this. Were they on the same trajectory?
Two things. First of all, I don't disagree with you at all in what your comments on the institution of slavery. You're absolutely right. There was a lot of chattel slavery in antiquity, quite right. And there's been chattel slavery in many different forms throughout the history of the world. So I don't disagree with any of that. But I simply wanted to focus on the fact that in the American case with Negroes, it was chattel slavery, and it was chattel slavery, I would say, with a vengeance. Now,
They made a business out of it.
So I don't disagree with that at all. Now, the question about the Roman Catholics is just fascinating. And let me just say two things about it real quickly. It could be the subject of a whole lecture, but just 2 points here. You have to understand that for much of the history of our country, Roman Catholics have been and felt themselves to be a minority out of the mainstream and having little or no political influence and power. And that translated into a reluctance to challenge the established institutions on anything which did not bear directly on their own interests. They challenged the public schools because they thought they were Protestant schools. That was something that required action on their part. But very little inclination to resist the institution of slavery in this period. There was a kind of what some historians, Catholic historians themselves, have characterized later as, for the longest time, a kind of accommodationist style, which oftentimes is true of marginalized groups generally. I could talk much more about, and the other thing which could be discussed, but I'm not going to take it up here except just to mention it, and that is, once the church becomes deeply indebted to large immigrant populations, the immigrant relation to the Black becomes another part of this equation. But that's not the part until much later. Great question.
Bruce, what a fantastic presentation. I've always thought, just to pick up on one of the points you made, that whenever you hear the presbytery invoking the peace and unity of the church, I find that almost despicable itself, because it's used so that they don't have to take a view of any consequence. And I wondered what your thoughts were.
Well, again, great question. How many hours do we have? Well, here, Del, I am more than maybe most people. I feel deeply torn by this topic,
Yes.
because well, let me say, I do feel in my own soul, you might say, a very strong desire for partisanship on the part of the church, especially on issues like slavery, where it seems to me that's just
so clear.
To me, you can speak for yourself. To me, it seems like, but I also have to say, when I actually am on the ground in a session meeting, in some gathering of fellow Christians, now I won't just say Presbyterians, but fellow Christians, there's also a part of me that wants to, as much as possible, work with these people, even the people with whom I disagree. And I think that's a legitimate concern. It's a biblical concern, the unity of the church. And I'm torn by those two things. So I think, Del, I hope you've sort of gathered by my tone, I was more than a little sarcastic about the peace and unity stuff, especially with regard to slavery. And yet, I'm not entirely one to just discredit it. I think there's a legitimate concern, a legitimate issue there. And my guess is that if we were having a conversation here about the stance of the Potomac Presbyterian Church on an issue like slavery, and we were in a conversation where there was disagreement about it, there would be a lot of feeling in this group. We've got to find a way of coming together. I'd be willing to bet it.
Yeah. Bruce, I was a little intrigued by your comparison of Henry Hyland Garnett to Frederick Douglass. I thought I heard you say that they were at odds with one another, but it seems like they would have been on the same page.
Well, great question. They were on the same page 90% of the way, but there was this great conference among Black leaders in the 1800s, early 1800s. And interestingly enough, Frederick Douglass was the one who said, we have got to find a way of working peacefully with the whites. Mm-hmm. And Henry Hyland Garnett, the clergyman, said, I think that's desirable in principle, but I'm very skeptical that it will yield a good result. I think ultimately the issue of slavery will be resolved by force. He said, I think the likelihood of this issue being resolved peacefully, especially with our working with the white population. And by the way, there was a deep split among the people who attended that meeting. And Henry Hyland Garnett was outvoted. But interestingly enough, he was the person who was the most skeptical of the possibility of real white cooperation yielding to a good outcome. And it was Douglas who said, well, I think we have to work in that way. So it was